Hello everyone, I'm Carol and welcome to Herb Gardening in Containers. And today I'm going to show you how to do a herb garden in a container. Homes and gardens nowadays are, a lot smaller than they used to be, and we find that containers can be very useful if you have a limited outdoor space. If you have a patio home or an apartment, a container can be very, very useful. They're easy to use, and if you have limited landscaping, they make gardening possible with even the most restricted spaces. The beauty of containers is that they allow you to garden instantly. You don't have hardly any effort, a minimum amount of effort, and you don't even have to worry about digging in the ground. If you have bad soil, you can actually just use a container, don't have to worry about digging in that. It's easy and it's very convenient to grow herbs in a container, and to be perfectly honest, it is much cheaper. If you're only going to pay a couple of dollars or $3 for one plant in a container such as this mint, even if you don't keep it for very long, it's still cheaper than going and buying some mint from the supermarket, because this is going to last longer than something that you would buy that isn't have a root and is not being kept alive. We can either have the container in the sun in the winter, and in the summer when it's hotter you would be moving the container into the shade. So containers are flexible, you can move them in and out of different areas depending on the location and the time of year. So that also makes it easier. It's convenient because it's much more convenient to have the container beside your house, next to the back door, so that when you're cooking, you can just go out and snip a few herbs, and you don't have to worry about going down to the bottom of the garden or wherever else you happen to have your herb garden if it was in the ground. So in that respect, a container garden with herbs is also very useful. Herbs are actually a lot easier to grow than many houseplants. This is a surprise to many people, but herbs are really quite forgiving. And because of that, they're really easy to grow generally. What they do need is 6 hours of sunshine, and we don't have a problem with that in Arizona. The reverse is the problem, too much sunshine. So the sunshine is not a problem. They need well-draining soil, obviously some water, and in the summer they'll need dappled shade. Herbs actually generally thrive on neglect, and so you don't even have to worry about fertilizing them very much. They will grow well for you. A lot of them are from the Mediterranean area. If we look at this plant, such as this rosemary here, this is a Mediterranean herb and it does very well here in Arizona. I'm going to talk about that a bit later on, but rosemary does not like a lot of water, and so it's a good plant to have in a pot, because if the pot dries out, the rosemary is very forgiving. I'm just going to talk for a moment now about the basics of container gardening, and this would apply to any plant, not just herbs. You want to make sure when you choose your container and your plants that you're going to put into it that you do not put different plants with different water requirements in the same pot. So for instance, if we were to take something like a rosemary here, which as I mentioned before is a low water use plant, it's from the Mediterranean region, it does not need very much water, it's very drought tolerant. You would not put that plant in the same pot as this, which is mint. As we know, mint grows in damp areas, it even grows in water, and it needs, it's a high water use herb. So that and this would not do well together in the same pot. If you did put them in the same pot, you would end up either killing the mint from not enough water or killing the rosemary from too much water. So you do need to know the water requirements of your plants before you put them together in the same container. So first things first, let's choose your container. Try and match your container to your house style. For instance, if you live in a Tuscan style house, it wouldn't necessarily go if you were to put a Southwestern style container with that decor. Similarly, if you had a very modern house, you may not wish to put something old-fashioned or more romantic looking type container. Try and match your container to your house if you can. You have various options with containers. This is a plastic container, and this is a terracotta container here. You can see how it looks there. This container, the terracotta container, is a reasonable size for the winter here. It is 8 inches, but it is far too small for the summer. In the summer, we recommend a minimum of 12 inches, which you can see is about the width there. And the reason for that is the plant container will dry out too much, and thus your plants will die. Similarly, in the summer, the pot, you don't want the pot to get too hot. So a pot which is this size will heat up much more quickly than a pot that is this size. So as well as the drying up, because it's terracotta, we've got the heating up because it's a smaller size. As opposed to this, which is metal, you would not wish to use a metal container here at all. A metal container gets really, really hot. If you can imagine, if the temperature outside is 115 degrees, the inside of this pot can get up to 140 degrees temperature and more, and basically will cook the roots of your plant. Similarly, if I just move this out of the way for one moment, you often see these kind of containers sold. This is actually sold as a herb container. Now, this may be a great herb container for somewhere like the East Coast, or somewhere north like Chicago, or somewhere in the south like Florida. But in Arizona in the summer, this is not going to work. It doesn't even work very well in the winter here. The clay is very absorbent of moisture. It pulls the moisture away from the plants, and it will dry out really quickly. If you also look at the tiny little planting holes here, you know, even if you put a little plant in there, it's going to need a lot of moisture to keep those roots comfortable. So it's pretty. You could use it for a plant in the winter, but definitely not in the summer. It also, because it's not really glazed, they do have a tendency to fall apart, these pots. So as far as my recommendations are concerned, in Arizona, I would stay with plastic or a composite, which is this, that looks like concrete, but it isn't. And the other reason is because the containers get very heavy. And if you can imagine this filled with soil and plants, this is quite a big container. And to try and lift it, it's not going to do your back any good. So think about these things when you're choosing your containers. You also want to think about drainage. So if we go back to this bluish green container that I showed you earlier, you want to make sure that your container has good drainage. If you look in the bottom of this container, you will see that some holes have been drilled. When you buy these containers, there's usually little marks on the bottom, and you could just take a drill and drill some holes in them. Or find somebody who has a drill and drill some holes in them. So this is what I'm going to use for one of our planting containers in a little while when I'm finished talking to you about this. There are other containers that you might have seen that have a little piece around the bottom here. They're self-watering containers. They can be good for plants that, the mint that we talked about earlier, that need a lot of water, but they're not so good for plants like the rosemary that really want to dry out between waterings. But again, they can be useful, used in the right position and used at the right time of year. So if we have another look at this pot that I talked about before, say you were going to use this for planting, which I will do in a moment, herbs don't really have huge roots, so they are fairly content in a pot like this, and in the winter they would be okay with a pot like this, one plant, because their roots are not huge like many other plants. So you're going to use this container, and in order to not make it so heavy, and if the roots of the herbs only go about this deep, you don't really need to fill the whole of the bottom of the pot with soil. So you're saving buying more soil or using more soil, but you can also reduce the volume and the weight by using something like this, which is actually broken up styrofoam from, you know, a packing of something. And I usually put these in the bottom of the container like that. And then to stop the soil falling, I would take some newspaper and I will push it over the top like this. And I'll just get another piece. And I will take that and I'm going to crumple it up. And there is a second use for the Arizona Republic. Push it in there, and you're basically creating a space that's, you're filling the space with, not with soil. So it's still light. You fill the volume of the bottom half of the pot but you're not using a lot of soil and you're saving your back. So you have your container, and next choice is what are you going to put into it? What type of soil mix is good for herbs? A good quality potting mix, a good quality potting soil is the type of soil that would be good for herbs. Most herbs are annuals, and so they grow pretty quickly. They don't need a lot of fertilizer. You can add a little extra fertilizer like this, which is a time release one. It lasts about 3 months, and if you see it, I'll just tip a little bit in so you can see what it looks like. It's these little granules that slowly will release their nutrients into the soil for the herbs. But generally, you want 1 gallon of soil per plant. And if you think what a gallon looks like, if I can just find my mint that's over here, here it is. This is what they call a gallon pot. Actually, it's a little smaller than a gallon, but it nearly, maybe it's a little bigger. The big black pots that you normally see at the nurseries and the stores. That's about how much each plant needs in the container. So you can think about that when you start to plant your plants. This is a smaller container. This is not a gallon container. This one is nearly a gallon. So for our purposes today, we can pretend it's a gallon. If you over-fertilize or over-water your herbs, it does actually affect their taste. They don't taste as good. So you don't need to over-fertilize herbs, which is good because you do tend to have to fertilize other plants in the valley, but not so much herbs. So you have your soil, and you can either use a bought mix, which is what this one is for today, or you can make your own, and we'll talk about that at another time, how to make your own compost. You can also even mix in a little bit of desert soil if you didn't have enough. It's all good. Herbs are pretty forgiving. In fact, something like the rosemary, believe it or not, you can just take the rosemary and actually take the dirt out of the soil in the desert and stick it in, and it'll grow really well. So you've chosen your container, you have your soil ready, so now you need to choose the plants to go in the pots. As you remember, I said before, you must have the same plants with the same water and soil requirements in the same pot. So again, you would not have rosemary, which needs dry and it's drought tolerant, next to something like parsley or mint, which is actually more high water use. Now, for those of us that live here in the valley, this is actually quite an easy choice to make, because generally the plants like rosemary or basil or sage, they are summer herbs, so they do well in the hot summer weather. Something like a parsley or a mint, or we even have dill here, another kind of parsley, they prefer the winter. They're annual plants, and so they will just grow in the winter, and by the time the hot weather comes around, they will be dying. Rosemary is unusual in that amongst some herbs it's a perennial herb, and perennial means that it comes back every year, it doesn't die. Thyme is the same. Thyme is a perennial herb. It creeps across the ground. It doesn't do great in the summer here, but it will survive the summer. Unlike, as I said, parsley, which is an annual. In other words, it will grow for one season, goes to seed, flowers, and then it dies. I wish you could smell this. It smells fabulous. The smell of all the different herbs. We should have smell-o-vision. It smells great. So the second thing you want to think about is, having decided to go and buy some plants, how do you find a healthy looking plant? Well, actually, you really don't want a plant that looks like this. This plant has been in this pot too long. Its roots are growing out of the bottom. For the purposes of today's demonstration, it was all I could manage to find in the stores, but it actually, it's getting a little bit past its prime. So you want a plant that doesn't have roots growing out of the bottom. You really don't want to look for a plant that's yellowing. Often that means it's been, being shipped across the country for too long of a time. This one's not too bad, and if you see, it's got some new growth coming out here, so we'll be okay with this. But again, look at the roots coming out the bottom. Those roots are actually dead. They've had air and light on them, and so the plant is not using those roots for anything because it's been ripped out of the ground where it was sitting before. So we'll be cutting those off when we plant that in the pot, and they'll be fine. They'll do fine. You want a nice, healthy plant. You also may wish to save yourself some money by picking a smaller plant. For instance, this is a good size rosemary in, a small pot. You could buy a gallon one, but if you're buying gallon annual herbs, they're not going to last as long. So, and they cost more money. So if you're on a budget, buy something small and just give it room to grow. And then you're saving your money by not having to go to the store to buy the plant, but you're also saving money by not having to spend too much money on the plants themselves. So you've had a look and you've decided that your plants are healthy looking. Now you have to decide what it is that you would like to buy. And there's a lot to choose from. So only pick and plant and grow what you like to eat. If, for instance, you don't like the aniseedy flavour of fennel or dill, then don't plant it unless you just want to grow it because it's pretty, and it really is a very pretty plant. I actually personally don't like fennel, but I know lots of people do, and it has the wonderful, beautiful foliage which is nice and fluffy and adds a nice texture to the pot. You could, in fact, select just an Italian group of herbs. So you'd go rosemary or the basil, the oregano, even the fennel. And this, which I'll talk about in a little while, is salvia. That's only grown for its flowers. You, again, remember to plant the same kind of plants, like the same water and soil and light requirements together. Again, many of our Mediterranean herbs do very well here because we have a similar climate, although a little hotter than the Mediterranean. You also want to look for plants that have a grey foliage. This is actually a curry plant. It does smell like curry. It smells lovely. Because it's grey, it means the plant is drought tolerant. It means it can survive very well with less moisture. And similarly, sage. We have a sage here. This is a plain, just regular sage. And then I believe I have a variegated sage here that's also pretty. These share the same water and light requirements. You could even just plant a whole pot of sages. Very pretty. Sage does not do well with too much watering. It will rot. So again, like the rosemary, similar light and water requirements. Just to reiterate, none of these plants will do well in full sun in June, July and August in Arizona in a pot. You will have to place them in the shade in the afternoon or under a tree in dappled shade. So you may allow them to have some early morning sun, maybe a tiny bit of sun before the sun goes down, but generally in the full heat of the summer, none of these herbs will do well in full sun all day. They will cook. So just remember that when you are choosing your location, choosing your type of pot and choosing your plants. You do have to take into account that Arizona summers are not forgiving. So as you can see, I have my pot ready. I have put the styrofoam in the bottom with the newspaper. It's a nice 12-inch pot. It's got some compost in. I'm just going to put a little bit more compost in here. And then I have my plants. And what I like to do is I like to place the plants in the pot first, just to make sure that I'm comfortable in their situation and that they're going to all sit well together. So for this purpose of today's pot, we have rosemary, which I'll just plant there. We have the curry plant, which is really grown for its aromatic smell and its beautiful grey foliage. We have this nice variegated sage, which can either go here or here. We'll have a look and let's decide which looks best. And then the creeping thyme, which will eventually start to cascade over the side of the pot. So I kind of like that look. We could switch it around and have that here and here, but no, I think that looks better. So got the pots, I'll just move them out of the way and I will show you how to plant them. So take the label off. Just put a hand over the top there like that. Supports the plant, and you're going to tip it like this and squeeze it and it will come off. Now look at the roots on this plant. They are very pot bound. You're going to die when you see what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to cut them with a knife. Hear the plant screaming. This actually is not going to do the plant any harm. It's just going to allow those roots to spread out and get them out of that habit of growing round in a circle, which can often be a problem for trees in this valley. I'm going to make a slight indentation here and push it in, and then push the soil around. We'll get some more, push it round, and more, and then that's really planted quite well. And next was the rosemary. Do the same again. You put your hands over the top. It stops the soil falling out, supports the plant without the stem breaking. I'm just going to squeeze it. This one's not so bad, the roots, but we'll just give them a little cut. And we're going to make a hole and pop it in. It can be quite firm with these. It's usually, they're quite forgiving. The thing that isn't forgiving is basil. It tends to snap off, but these are tougher. These are woodier plants. We have our curry plant. This is in a smaller pot. Pull it over. Doesn't want to come out. There you go. Cut it. Pop it in. Let's have a bit more soil in here. Pack it around. While you're doing this, you have to remember that it's a container, and you do know that eventually the plants will grow out of the size of the container. The time is looking good, actually, and probably what will happen with the end of this container is these 3 plants will eventually go to meet their maker, pass away. The rosemary will keep on going, and you may end up with just the rosemary in the container, which is fine. Remember, you just have to accept that containers are not forever, especially herb gardening in containers. You're lucky if you get a year out of it. 2 years possibly, but usually a year. So there we have it. We have a beautiful container. I like the way the colour of the pot is picked up in the colours of the leaves. We have different textures going on here. We have a nice one that can grow over the edge here and trail. It smells fantastic. The only other thing that you can do is put a little bit of mulch on the top if you wanted to. Organic mulch, not stone. Stone could look pretty, but it's going to be too hot here in the summer. It'll make the pot even hotter. The final thing to do is to give it a drink of water. So let's just give it a little bit and we're good to go. So here we have our second pot. I have already previously put the styrofoam in and the paper, the newspaper, and added the dirt on the top. I just want to remind you that when you do put newspaper in, it does rot down. So don't put too much newspaper in, or else the volume of the pot will drop, and that's not good for the plants. I prefer to put more styrofoam in the bottom. But the newspaper helps, helps as well. But if it does drop, you can just add some more compost on the top. So for this pot, which as you can see, I've picked a different colour, it's a slightly different pot, we're going to put this in, which is the fennel, which will die back, but when we come back again. We've got the basil and we've got the oregano. I apologise, I am saying basil, I can't say it the other way, I am British, it's just the way I am. The thing about basil that you do need to know, a lot of people say, my basil's gone all mouldy. Basil likes, that smells really good, it likes a lot of air around it. So it's often better in a pot on its own if you're going to stuff it with a lot of stuff. For today's purposes, it's just to show you a group of Italian type herbs, the oregano, the basil and the fennel, all Italian type herbs. But if your basil is going mouldy and it's not growing well, then it's too wet and it's not getting enough air around it for it to grow. So let's have a go at planting these now. I'm going to take the fennel, which as you can see has great roots coming out the bottom. Fennel is actually often a perennial, it can come back again. So we take the label off, put that in again later. You can see the roots here, I'm just going to cut them, spread them out a bit, and then just pop it in here. Really pretty. It's so lacy and airy. It's lovely, lovely plant. And I know the bulb tastes good when you cook it. It's just not my personal preference, but each to their own. And we'll put that in there. Just a bit more. This is a bigger pot. It takes more soil. Then, excuse me, we're going to get the oregano, which is Greek oregano, although, it's also from all the Italian and Mediterranean countries. this is actually soft enough I can just pull it apart with my fingers. You see there? I've just pulled it apart a little bit. I'm going to plant that in here. Make a hole, pop it in. It smells great. And then the basil. Be careful when you plant basil. I've already managed to snap that off, as you saw. It's quite brittle. And even though you can see here, there are 3, 4, 5 little seedlings growing, it won't do well if you pull it apart. It's better to just leave them at this, if you're planting in the summer or in the spring. And we're just going to pop it in like that. And there you can see there's a lot of space in this, which is fine. If you did, not for today's purposes, but if you did wish to fill your container more with colour, you can go with something like this. This is actually a salvia, and you will see this actually for sale as an annual plant. It's actually a perennial, this salvia. And although you generally don't eat the leaves, the flowers are beautiful red and attract hummingbirds. But you can eat the flowers. The flowers you can put in a salad, and they don't really taste a lot, but they make the salad look pretty. So should you wish to add a bit of extra colour to your pot, say it was not this pot but some other, you can actually do this and just bob in a couple of these salvias just to add a bit of colour. I'll just pop another one in just so you can see what they look like. It doesn't want to come out. There. And we just take off a few of these dead leaves at the bottom. And then pop it in there, and it does add that nice bit of colour that will just draw your eye and make it look pretty. And if you wished, again, you can mulch this. Just helps keep the roots cool, and it also helps retain moisture. Don't use those large pine bark nuggets, they're too big. But you could use some regular mulch if you wanted, again, but nothing that isn't organic. Even some dried up pine needles or something like that would help. You don't have to, but it can be helpful. It also helps if you have a lot of birds in your garden, like I do. I have the grackles, and they come along, and the curved-billed thrushes, and they get in there with their beaks and just flick everything out. By putting a bit of mulch on there, it stops them doing that, or helps stop them. So there we have our second container. So now you have your container all planted. It's all nicely, the soil is all nicely pushed in and firm around the plants, and it's been watered. How do you care for it now it's all done? Well, herbs thrive when they do not flower. You don't want to let them flower, especially basil. So when the flowers come, you're going to pinch them off, because if you don't, it will affect the flavour of the basil. So we want to keep them pinched back. You can do it with your fingers like this, or you could do it with a pair of scissors like this. And of course you have an added bonus. Unlike most plants, you would be throwing this away, but here you can go and use that for your cooking. It smells really good, the oregano, it's lovely. Put that on a pizza. The basil's not flowering, but you get the idea. Salvia, we're actually growing it for the flowers, so we'll leave that alone. The fennel will eventually die down. So that's the care as far as taking care of the actual plants are concerned, in that their shape and their structure. I'm going to just prune that off because that's better. So then we're watering them. In the summer, you'll probably have to water them every day. You would probably have a saucer underneath here. Make sure that you don't have too much water sitting there for a long time, because as you know, standing water here in the valley, you get mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes lay their eggs, and then we might have a whole West Nile virus thing going on. So that's not good. And then finally, especially with a pot like this, it's a little top heavy. We have our storms in the summer, our monsoon storms, which can be quite devastating. And if you think you're going to have a monsoon storm, or you see one coming and your plant is out under a tree that it might blow over or something like that, move your plants in the container to somewhere sheltered so that they don't get blown over and all the soil falls out and the plants die. Or sometimes this happens, it's so windy it shreds the plants, and they will recover, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Just, if you can move it out of the way, move it out of the way. So you have your container, you're taking care of it, you're good to go. So harvest, grow, enjoy your herbs. I'm Carol, and I love to garden.